Physics math, the uncertainties are lesser. In economics math, the uncertainty is basically human beings. The biggest assumption that economics relies on is the assumption that human beings are rational. But that's not true. We know that there are a lot of irrationalities that exist that makes economics not so right all the time.
Hi friends, hello and welcome to the Nails and Hammers podcast. Our guest for today is Prithvi Kodhamarti, who is a behavioral science lead at Grab. We talk about her career journey, understand what behavioral science is all about, how Prithvi goes about solving problems in her day-to-day life, and finally talk about the intersection of behavioral science and technology. It's time to listen and learn. Hi Preeti, welcome to the Nails and Hammers podcast. So, can you share a bit about where did you grow up and where did you go to school?
Hi, very excited to be here. So I grew up in Delhi, did my entire schooling in Delhi. My dad was posted there, but I'm actually from the south of India.
Mhm.
But because I grew up in Delhi, I call Delhi home now. I did my schooling there, I did my engineering there as well, and I also did my MBA from FMS Delhi. And then after that, I moved to Bombay where I worked for a few years, and I lived in Bangalore for a few years. And then I did another master's. This was in London, and then I moved to Singapore. So that's where I am now.
So, you did your engineering first and then you did your MBA. So, what motivated you to do an MBA?
I don't think in India people do an MBA because they're motivated. They
Yeah.
do it because everybody does it. So
Mhm.
engineering and MBA is probably the safest line that anybody would
Yeah.
choose. So
I think people first do engineering and then they figure out what do they want to do with things in life.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, how was the FMS experience like?
FMS was very interesting for me. I think for me it was the time where I discovered my love for marketing and for presentations, and that was the time when I actually got out and spoke publicly in a lot of places, and
Mhm.
it gave me the confidence that I needed to get into the corporate world. So I actually really enjoyed my time at FMS.
Mhm. And then you worked at Mahindra for like 4 years.
Yeah.
And what made you do a career switch and get a degree in behavioral science?
So at Mahindra, I was initially in a strategy role. So the group company has a lot of sectors. So I was looking at a few of them, and that was an interesting role. But as a part of that, I also co-founded a startup within the Mahindra group. So this was like an Uber for tractors. So I was running marketing for that. And while I was doing that, I spent a lot of my time in rural India speaking to farmers, and what seemed like such an obvious solution to them that you can now rent a tractor was actually not so easily welcomed by farmers. So that actually got me thinking about consumer behavior and why do people behave the way they do, and how can we actually do marketing the right way if we understood consumer behavior better. So that's what got me into behavioral science. So then I started reading more about it, and that intrigued me a lot. So then I decided to quit my job and do another master's in behavioral science. So I did that, and then after that I came here.
So did you like read books and stuff?
Yeah, I read a lot of books, saw a lot of talks, and in general, I found the subject very intriguing, but I wasn't sure how do I actually start applying this, and I didn't know if I had all the tools to start doing this the right way. So that's when I thought it might help to do a master's.
So what exactly is behavioral science?
So behavioral science is basically a subject that deals with understanding how people think. So typically in any behavioral science terms, you'll hear the word system one and system two. So basically, that says that our brain has two ways of thinking. If I ask you what's 10 into 5, you just instantly know the answer. If I make an angry face, you know I'm angry. If something's coming in your way, you know you have to move. All that is very instinctive and intuitive to you. So that is the system one part of our brain, which is basically very fast, instinctive, uses a lot of heuristics and makes quick decisions for you. So that's one part of the brain. The second part of the brain is system two, where basically you make a lot of rational decisions and you're thinking through things. If I ask you what's 343 into 257, you're going to take your time to think about that. Typically, what happens is both these systems exist in our brain. In most of our day-to-day decisions, system one is the one that takes the lead. So for most decisions, you don't actually think too much. You just make quick decisions. And system two kicks in when it is actually required to. So what behavioral science does is it understands how system one thinks, and then it uses that information to nudge people towards certain behaviors. A
Mhm.
simple example would be people generally just take whatever is in the eye line in supermarkets because they don't want to spend the time to think about things. So if you want people to eat healthy, you would typically just replace everything from the eye level. You replace all the snacks at eye level with fruits because you know you want people to eat healthier. People will keep doing what they're doing because they're habituated to that. But now instead of snacks, they're actually eating something healthy.
So system one here means like amygdala and prefrontal cortex, which is like the fast brain
Yeah,
which thinks in the concept of fight or flight.
exactly. Yeah. It uses a lot of heuristics and sometimes biases to come to certain conclusions.
Mhm. So how do you go about solving a given problem?
So typically what we would do is we would look at the existing behavior and we try and understand why the behavior exists the way it does. Then we do something like a behavioral audit. So you look at all kinds of barriers and biases that exist in that process. Why are people behaving the way they behave? Some of it is existing knowledge, some of it you might come to know through experiments, some of it you come to know by talking to people. So you use all these resources to try and understand the existing behavior and why it exists the way it is. And then we look at behavior change and we say, okay, we want people to do another behavior instead of this behavior. What's the ideal behavior? And
Mhm.
how can I use, what kind of a nudge can I use to get people to try out that new behavior?
Mhm.
And we generally do that through interventions and then we measure it through experiments.
So since you mentioned bias, can you share an example of what a bias might look like?
And there are a lot of examples. So typical one would be if I ask you a simple question, I say Jack is 6 feet 4 inches tall. What is his favorite sport?
I'll say basketball.
Yeah. So I've done this I do a lot of workshops at Grab and outside as well. I've asked this question every single time and I've always received the same answer. But Jack could be tall and still like chess, right?
Mhm.
So what our brain does is it uses something like a representative heuristic. It says that okay, tall people play basketball. Jack is tall. He must like basketball.
Mhm.
That's a typical example of our brain using a shortcut
Mhm.
to come to a conclusion. It's not that shortcuts are always bad. Sometimes these shortcuts are useful because you can't go through day-to-day life every time thinking through every single decision. So a lot of times these are actually useful. The problem is when the bias misleads you in some way. For example, actually, one way to visualize this would be a dartboard, right? So if you have a dartboard and you're hitting, you don't know how to hit darts, so you're hitting randomly. That would be an example of me asking you, Jack is 6 feet 4 inches tall. What's his favorite sport? You say basketball, somebody says chess, somebody says football, somebody says cricket. That's darts going everywhere. That's an error, which is okay. Errors happen. But when I say Jack is 6 feet 4 and everybody says basketball, that's an error, but it's just hitting the dart in the wrong place. So that's a bias. So that's like a predictable error. You know that everybody is going to be wrong in the exact same way. To
Mhm.
solve that problem, you can do two things. You can either move the dartboard a little to the left so that people keep doing what they're doing, but now they're actually hitting the center, or you can shift their hand a little bit so that they continue the same motion, but now they're hitting the right place. So
Mhm.
that's basically what nudging is all about, understanding the direction in which people are hitting and either moving the dartboard or moving the people.
So there's like about 200 biases mentioned on Wikipedia. So is it possible that something that behavioral economists might consider a bias is completely rational decision?
Okay, absolutely. That's what I was trying to say earlier as well. It's known that not all biases are bad. Sometimes we actually need these biases because you can't go through day-to-day life without some of these shortcuts. So it's not true that all of those biases have to be misleading us in some way. Those biases exist for a reason. It is for our survival. So it's not like all of them are bad.
Mhm. If everyone thinks differently, how can similar solutions be applied to a wide range of people?
Actually, no, everybody. So the biases that are normally documented are the ones that are exhibited by a large number of people. So these are biases that exist everywhere. Everybody knows these are there. Everybody behaves in the same way. Only then do they actually get documented as biases.
Mhm. How frequently should you nudge someone to encourage like a positive reactance from a person?
There is no right answer to that because there are a lot of objections to nudging people too much, which is fair. People should not be nudged again, especially if it is against their will. And also that people get smart to nudges. So when you do it often, people know that you're nudging them. So they may not even be ready to take the action that you want them to. There are a lot of ethical concerns around nudging. Generally, the kind of things you should ask yourself before you nudge somebody. I think the one question you should definitely ask is, if after you've done the nudge, you tell the person that you actually did this, would they be happy with it or would they be angry about it? So if you tell somebody that, hey, I nudged you to eat snacks, to eat healthier food, maybe they might be happy about it. But someone might say that, you know what, I actually wanted to eat unhealthy. Who are you to come and tell me that I should be eating healthy? So every time you're looking at nudging, if you're looking for positive reactance, this is the one thing you should definitely look at is the ethics of nudging and how much does the person actually want this action that you want them to do.
Mm-hmm. But should that not defeat the purpose of a nudge?
My point wasn't that you should tell the person. My point was think about what would happen if you actually told the person.
Okay. Why is physics math perfect and economics math not?
Because in physics math, the uncertainties are lesser.
Mm-hmm.
In economics math, the uncertainty is basically human beings.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest assumption that economics relies on is the assumption that human beings are rational.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not true. We know that there are a lot of irrationalities that exist that makes economics not so right all the time. But with physics, a lot of these irrationalities can also be, a lot of the imperfections can be measured and put in, like something like friction can actually be measured and put into the equation. But you can't always do that with economics.
Mm-hmm. So,
for things like affect and emotion,
mm-hmm.
you can't really measure those and put those into an equation.
Mm-hmm. So electrons and protons are going to behave exactly in all the conditions, but people might behave differently.
Exactly.
Yeah. So is every decision a bet at the end of the day?
A bet?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I think so. I mean, most of the times people don't think through their decisions, but in the limited resources and the constraints of all the cognitive bandwidth that they have, they are definitely taking a bet and thinking that they're making the right decision.
Mm-hmm. How do you translate the concepts of behavioral science into the world of technology?
Well, now there is the whole new upcoming field of behavioral design, which basically takes into account the behavioral science behind somebody's behavior and bakes that into the design itself. So earlier, a few years ago, maybe design was all about designing the perfect flow. Now it is about understanding how people actually behave and designing for that. So a lot of things, like some common examples you would have seen of behavioral design would be things like defaults. When you put a tick mark on a subscription and you know people are not going to check against it, that's basically behavioral design. Understanding that people already have this behavior, that people don't check out of things, so put a default tick mark. So that's an example of using behavioral science into design. Another example would be anchoring, where you slash a price and you show a lower price because you know that people are going to look at that price and see the slash and they'll be anchored to the previous amount and think of this as a lower price.
Also things such as like a price of 199 looks cheaper than a
Exactly.
price of 200.
Yeah.
So what's your day-to-day role at Grab like?
So at Grab my work, I have like 2 or 3 different types of work. One of them is working with the product and the design team directly. So that work would typically be, so whatever problem that they're trying to solve, whatever product they're trying to create, helping them understand that product from a consumer and a behavioral science point of view, and helping them break down that flow, bringing in all the behavioral science principles so that even before they start designing, they're aware of what consumer behavior is going to be like so that they can design for that. That's one part of it. Another part of it is fundamental research, which is asking very basic questions about human behavior and answering those so that product design and marketing teams can take that up and use it later. So you would ask very basic questions like, why do people hate surge pricing? Or is ride hailing system fair to drivers? Something as basic as that, but then building on that and creating a framework for product and design teams to think about and innovate around that. And then the third part of the work is generally experimentation, which is using communications or design as base and running experiments on that to see which systems work, which interventions work best for behavior change.
So since you brought up the notion of working with data and figuring out, hey, if why do people think that surge pricing is bad, so how do you collect that data?
Well, there are two parts of it. One of it is the typical data that we have, which is your book through rates and at what price do people stop booking and at what price does the book through rate fall. And that's the typical data that we already have that analytics teams look at. Combine that with user research data. So we usually talk to consumers and we get people into the room and we speak to them. And then we let them talk about their experiences and what they think about surge. And we let them narrate instances of high surge. And we try and pick out the typical kind of emotions that they spoke about. And then we put both of them together and we create a framework to think about what could be like a typical psychological process that happens when surge pricing, when people see surge prices.
I have two follow-ups to that. First of all, how do you ensure that the sample is random, meaning that the sample that you have is not biased? So it's likely that people who are frequent users of your product might show up in your office for an interview, but someone who hates your product might not show up. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's definitely there. There's always a selection bias, but the research team usually takes care of this. This is the user research team. So what they generally do is they look at the people's data as well. So they try and so we generally give some kind of a metrics and we say that we want users from these 4 or 5 profiles. So we try and pick people from different types of profiles so that we have all kinds of users. And then within that, they reach out to users and they talk to them. So that's one. The other thing is also that we don't just use this data, but we also look at other things like social media listening and what are people actually saying. So a lot of the people who actually go online and complain, the ones who really hate us, so they are the ones who go online and complain. So we usually pick a lot of stuff from there as well. What are people saying? And then we also have a voice of customer metric within Grab, which is through complaints and feedbacks and what are people actually talking about.
So a company like Grab has operations in 7 countries. So if people think differently, let's say in Singapore and in Philippines, so has it happened that you have a different solution for Philippines, a different solution for Singapore?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we've seen like the cultural differences are so huge between these countries that we see like very big differences in how they actually look at the product and how they actually interact with the product. One of the best examples for us has always been tipping. So tipping as a culture actually doesn't exist in Southeast Asia in general, and definitely not in Singapore. So we were doing this study around promos and helping and trying to understand what people think about promos. So when we asked people in Singapore, people would always be complaining and saying we want more promos. Grab used to give a lot more promos. Now they've stopped giving these discounts and stuff. Then we spoke to people in Indonesia and Jakarta. Surprisingly, people there said, yeah, promos are good, but every time I apply a promo, I feel really bad for the driver because I feel like I'm not giving them enough. So I tip them more. So people use promos to reduce their cost, but they actually end up paying more because they feel bad for the drivers and they tip them. And we realized that tipping as a cultural norm is different in different countries. People have different expectations from it, and they have different expectations from Grab as well. So when we launched tipping, that was actually something that was taken into account that in a country like Indonesia, we might have a completely different use case as compared to Singapore.
You also mentioned experiments earlier. Can you elaborate a bit about that? What experiments are and how do you perform experiments?
So experiments are typically when we divide the users into a couple of groups. One will be a control group where we don't do any intervention, and there'll be a treatment group where we try out something different, maybe in content or design or communications or something. And then we see how both the groups perform to see whether or not the treatment was actually more effective than the control. So
Mhm.
examples would be things like, so for example, when we did the surge pricing study, one of the things we realized was that people feel like Grab is not transparent about the reasons behind surge and that we are not truthful about it, which made sense because at one point our only statement used to be high fare due to high demand.
Mhm.
And this would also show up at 1 in the night when it wasn't actually true. There's no demand. The reason the fare was high was because there were no cabs around.
Mhm.
So then we made a whole product around contextual communications where it takes into account various signals. And when there is a surge price, it tells you the price based on what kind of context actually exists. So in the
Mhm.
middle of the night, the message that would go out now would say, your Batman driver is arriving for you to tell you that it's the middle of the night and that the reason why the fare is high is because there are few drivers around and the ones who are coming are actually doing you a favor by doing that. So we had a bunch of these different messages. So we had a control group where we had no messages, just the standard high fare due to high demand. And to the other group, we had these different messages. And then in the end, we ran a survey to see how people actually see the transparency of Grab. And we
Mhm.
realized that the treatment group actually genuinely felt that we were way more transparent about our prices.
So how do you decide if something is not working out?
So if there is no difference between the control and the treatment groups, then you know that the impact of the intervention is not high enough.
Mhm. Then, like, is every decision that people can make, like, does it boil down to doing experiments on scale?
Not every decision can be done that way, although it would be awesome if we could do that. But experimentation is expensive as well because it means that you've already put in money into the product. So we try and limit experimentation to communications and content stuff.
Mhm.
But much of the design that happens before that stage is not based on experiment. It's based on research and theory, and then we take a bet on it and we design.
Mhm. What are your thoughts on unintended consequences of technology, as in when a habit forming product becomes addictive?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work around that. I'm not much of an expert to talk on that, but yeah, I mean, even from like somebody who uses technology a lot, I can definitely vouch for that, that a lot of tech companies have used some of these irrationalities in the wrong way, and they had too much time to build on that and build these habits in a way. But now I think companies are becoming smarter and customers are becoming even more smarter. So companies are being forced to relook at what kind of habits they're driving. So companies like Apple and even Google are now bringing in things like digital well-being so that they're able to tell customers about their good intentions so that it's not always the bad thing that comes out.
Mhm. Digital well-being came really late into the picture, but while
Actually came
building the
really.
product, no one thought about that.
Exactly. Which is why one of the things that we've done at Grab, which I'm very proud of, is that we actually have an ethical framework around nudging.
Mhm.
So for any nudge that we bring in, we try and answer these questions so that we are sure that we are not nudging people the wrong way. And we've done a lot of work around that, whether it is the ethics of nudging, whether it is fairness. So we've created these checklists that the design and the product teams can use, and they can actually ask these questions and make sure that they're on the right side of the line. So if there's anything that's on the wrong side, we try and speak to, like within the team, we try and talk and we decide whether or not it's worth, whether the monetary benefit from that is worth the whatever ethical line that we are crossing. And if it's not, then we scrap it or we think of ways in which this can actually be done in an ethical way.
Mhm. We talked earlier about being and thinking that, hey, if we are nudging too much, is it ethical or not? So, what are your thoughts on transparency instead? If tech companies justify a decision behind a notification or something, is that what we should do going forward?
Transparency is probably one of the ways in which you can help customers decide whether or not they should trust us. It is definitely one of the important ways. You should definitely, at least at Grab, we've been trying that a lot, being more transparent with with drivers, passengers, as well as merchants, to tell them what's happening in the system and why they're seeing what they're seeing. That's one way. But I also think that that can't be the only way. Like, just because you're transparent doesn't mean you can still get away with a lot of stuff. So while you are being transparent, you still need to take into account the fact that consumers are depending on you, and there are many other things that you have to think about when you are nudging them.
How different is theory from practical applications?
Some of them are like human truths. So the theory is as good as the application, and it's good that these theories exist because you can apply them directly. But a lot of them are, like we were talking earlier, a lot of them come without a cultural context. A lot of the behavioral science studies have been done in the Western countries. So they're typically done on it's called a weird audience, which is, I think, Western, educated, industrialized, something. So basically, it's done on most of the studies have been done on a particular type of audience. And when that study is probably replicated in another cultural context, it may fail completely. So that's why the experimentation part is important. Knowing that the theory exists, but then putting into application and experimenting is the right way to actually do it.
Now I want to instead pivot on the COVID situation. So what do you think is going to be the new normal like?
I don't know, but so many people have been asking me about this that I feel like I should have an answer prepared for this now. It's going to be, so there are a few things that will definitely change in terms of human behavior. People are going to be way more health conscious. I think the amount of time people are spending at home will probably change a lot of the norms in terms of how they'll go out, when they'll go out, whether they're okay eating out, and a lot of consumer behavior changes will definitely happen. People will also probably be more risk averse for a while, at least till they feel like things are back to normal. We will see people taking much less risks, whether it is with travel, whether it's with adventure, whether it's with business. I think people are going to, for a while at least, we should be prepared for a very subdued world, I think.
So why do we respond more to fear?
Well, I think that's something that we spoke about initially, which is the flight or fight response. Fear is what gets us to respond really fast. And fear is also something that comes up really fast. So when people do a risk appraisal, the second they realize that they are susceptible to a risk and they feel like they don't have a control over it, or they don't know what they can do, or even if they do something, it will not result in something effective, the first reaction is fear, which is what happened in this case, which is what happens in the case of natural disasters and stuff, where you know that this exists, you're susceptible, but you can't do anything about it. It's out of your control. That's when the fear reaction comes in.
What can governments do to maintain social distancing and enforce good habits on people after the lockdown?
I think governments are already doing a lot, but at this point, the only thing they can do, I think they've covered the whole spectrum. They've gone from advisory all the way to punishment now. I think one of the things that some of the governments are doing really well is around communicating it the right way. I think that is the important part. So there are three or four principles that, from like looking at different communications in different countries, have used. So there are three or four principles that come out. One of them is transparency. Governments have been trying to be very transparent, whether it is Singapore government sending WhatsApp messages with complete details about cases, or every government now has a dashboard where they're being very transparent about cases and information. I think that's very important because it builds trust and gives people the confidence to know that, okay, this is happening and the government is doing these steps to ensure that we're okay. So transparency is the first thing. The second is shared value. I think the one thing that everybody is aware of now is that this is an us versus an unknown situation. We know, so everybody's in this together, and all governments have been actively doing that. If you see the speeches where the Indian Prime Minister, he's been consistently saying that we're in this together. And it's the same across the world. I think everybody has been using this consistent message of us versus them. So that whole idea of shared value, that it doesn't matter which place you're from, it doesn't matter how much money you have, we are all in this together and we're sort of sharing this experience. So that's one. The third would be around social norms, telling people what others are doing so that they know that that's the right thing to do. So 99% of people are following the lockdown, or most people are staying at home. If you're not, then you're the one who's a risk to the others. I think that's another important part which has come out in a lot of government communication, which is putting forward social norms and telling people the norm that others are following. And the last would be around self-image. So this is something that generally works, which is reminding people of the self-image they have of themselves. So at this point, the self-image everybody has is that they are responsible people and it's others who are causing the problem. So reinforcing that and reminding people that as responsible citizens, this is what you should be doing. I think that's the part that a lot of governments are focusing on now, communicating and speaking to the self-image that people have of themselves. So these are like roughly the 3-4 areas which I felt came out as strong positives in how governments are communicating around this.
So should people use public transport now on? Or if government should encourage people to do so?
Currently, no, but maybe once the situation is down, then is okay, then we'll face a different kind of problem. That'll be how do we get people back? How do we make people realize that the risk is not there anymore and that it's okay for them to get back to normal and start using public transport and all other services? I think that will be a different kind of challenge to solve.
Now I want to shift focus on Priti as a person. So how do you unwind?
I keep doing a lot of things. So we started a podcast as well.
Mhm.
So we started this in Jan this year. So some of my weekends go into that, working on the research for that and recording and marketing that and stuff. So that is something that I enjoy. In general, I really enjoy the subject. So I spend a lot of my free time as well, either reading or doing this stuff. I consult for a few startups on a voluntary basis. So I do that as well. In terms of other stuff, I like playing the piano. So I do that. I like cooking. And I've been cooking a lot ever since the lockdown
Yeah.
started. So yeah.
But Singapore is apparently a food haven for otherwise.
Yeah. It's good for non-vegetarians, but I'm a vegetarian, so I end up cooking most of the time.
I mean, Little India is a good place.
That's true, yeah.
So what books are you reading right now?
I actually just started this book called Mindset. It's by Carol Dweck. It's about the growth and fixed mindsets thing. So that's as a research for my upcoming podcast.
So tell us a bit more about your podcast.
So the podcast is called The Work Brain, and it was started by me and another friend of mine, a junior from FMS. He stays in Berlin and he's a management consultant. So it actually started exactly a year back when we just connect. Actually, I don't even know him personally. We just connected on LinkedIn and we had a couple of conversations and it seemed like an interesting thing to do. So we spent like a couple of months trying out different ideas, what format works, what doesn't, and stuff. And then finally, we landed on the idea that we want to bring behavioral science to people in a way that they can relate to and actually apply in their day-to-day life. And that could be work-related stuff, that could be just how you can live better and stuff. So that's how we started. So now what we try and do is we pick a random topic in behavioral science and then we research on that, and then the podcast generally is like a conversation between us where I come in as somebody who's coming from a behavioral science background and he comes in as a management consultant, and between us we break down a behavioral science topic and then we try and understand the applications of it for day-to-day life.
And what are you curious about next?
I am curious, as a behavioral scientist, this is a very exciting time to be alive because the whole world is going through so much of behavioral changes. I am very curious to know where we are going to be in 6 to 9 months from now. What are the behavior changes that will happen, and what will be permanent, what will not be permanent, and what will be the personality changes that will happen, what will be the cultural changes that will happen, and how will that impact the rest of our lives? I'm very curious to know that.
If someone has to learn more about behavioral science, how can they do so?
There are a lot of resources online now. There are a lot of good books. A good starting point for anybody is obviously Thinking Fast and Slow, but it's a heavy book. So if you're dedicated, then you get through that somehow. And then there are a bunch of other books out there. Books by Dan Ariely, by Taylor. There
Mhm.
are a lot of good books out there for the subject,
And
and a lot of good podcasts as well.
Nudge is a great book, I would say.
Yeah, Nudge is a very good book. Yeah.
What different career options are available in this domain?
So from what I have seen, it's a very new field, so very hard to predict anybody's career path on this. But from what I have understood, there are like two or three rough areas. One of them is behavioral science, which works with product and design. So that'll be like behavioral design. That's typically in the tech space. The second one would be behavioral science in marketing, which works more with marketing teams to understand consumer behavior and then putting it directly into advertising and marketing. So that's one space. And the third one is around behavioral decision science, which would be a combination of behavioral science and data science. So that actually works more on modeling human behavior and then using that directly in algorithms and stuff. So at least from and the fourth one would be behavioral science in public policy, which is working with governments and nonprofits and using behavioral science to design better public policy. So these are the three or four areas that I could identify, but I'm sure there are more out there.
So the master's degree that you have obtained, is that like a generic thing which can be applied to a bunch of domains that you just mentioned?
It did not cover the data science bit at all, but it does cover marketing, public policy, and the generic stuff as well.
Mhm. What advice would you give to a 20-year-old Preeti?
I would probably tell her to not be too concerned about career at that point because you never know where it will go. Like I never thought I'll be a behavioral scientist in Singapore and grab 20, when I was 20. So I would definitely, at that point, it seemed like engineering and MBA was everything and that I had it all sorted.
Mhm.
So I would definitely tell 20-year-old myself to not be too bothered about career.
Mhm.
I think you
Uh,
should just be bothered about learning new stuff and doing new things.
I mean, it's always interesting in the hindsight that,
Yeah,
and lastly, if people have to reach out to you and learn more about you, how can they do so?
I'm available on LinkedIn.
Mhm.
If you look up Preeti KS, I should be there. I'm also quite active on Twitter. I share a lot of stuff there. My ID would be Preeti_please. So
Mhm.
both of these are like available and you can DM me anytime there.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Preeti, for being a guest on the podcast. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Absolutely. You made me think about so many things that I haven't thought about in so long. So thank you
Mhm.
for having me over. I think this was fun.